Dude, I was having a conversation with my friends the other day, and we were all talking about who was the biggest band of the 1980s. And my friends are all trying to say The Police or Def Leppard or Bon Jovi. And I'm like, you're out of your mind, dude. It was totally Genesis. And they're like, Genesis? Are you freaking kidding me? I'm like, I am not freaking kidding you. Genesis, hello. And so I really wanted to revisit why Genesis was the biggest band, undisputed biggest band of the 1980s. Just to give you a little history, Genesis started life in the late 60s as an art rock band. They evolved in the early 70s into a progressive rock band. Their frontman's main songwriter was Peter Gabriel. You had Steve Hackett on guitar. You had Mike Rutherford on guitar and bass. You had Phil Collins on drums and Tony Banks on keyboards. Well, after about 5 or 6 albums, Peter Gabriel jumped ship. He wanted to start a solo career. 2 albums after that, Steve Hackett took off to have a solo career. And they were down to a trio of Phil Collins, Tony Banks, and Mike Rutherford. And you would think that would be enough to totally wipe them out. There was no way they were going to be able to recover from Steve Hackett leaving, who was a great guitarist, and Peter Gabriel, who basically was the Syd Barrett of the group. But they did rebound, and they recorded a couple albums in the late 1970s, early 80s that didn't do a whole lot. But in 1982, I believe it was, they came out with this masterpiece, Abbacab. And this album really was their commercial breakthrough. It put them back on the map. Everybody loved this album. It sold about, I don't know, like 4 million copies. It had the hits No Reply at All on here, the title track Abbacab, Man on the Corner. People were just eating this album up. And they were on tour, and they were selling out stadiums. They had screaming fans at all their concerts. They could barely hear themselves play. And Phil Collins, who had kind of always been a sex symbol for Genesis in the 70s, really emerged as kind of that teen idol, the personality behind the band. He had a couple of successful solo albums until Genesis really broke through with their self-titled album, and I believe this was 83 or 84, if I'm not mistaken. This is 83, so this album came out in 1983, and it was all over. It was full on Genesis hysteria. They were besieged by fans in their hotel rooms. Phil Collins was on the cover of every major teen magazine as a heartthrob. He was on People magazine. I mean, he was just everywhere. There was no escaping Phil Collins mania and Genesis mania, or Genesis hysteria as it was called back then. They had videos for all of their songs on MTV, Mama, That's All, Illegal Alien, Taking It All Too Hard, Just a Job to Do. This was a powerhouse album. It sold, I think, like 3 billion copies, and you could not get away from Genesis. They were on the radio, they were on TV all the time, they were in every single major magazine. They had, might have had a cartoon show for all I know. All the kids back in the day when I was in junior high school, all the kids, they had Genesis buttons, they had Genesis stickers, they had Genesis backpacks, Genesis t-shirts. Some of them were wearing Genesis costumes for Halloween. It was all over everywhere. People forget in the early 80s, Genesis ruled the airwaves, and they were inescapable to the point where the market was really oversaturated with Genesis material, and they thought there is no way that they can possibly replicate this. But oh yes, they did. Not only did they replicate it, but they did even better. Try 8 billion albums sold worldwide of their follow-up, Invisible Touch, which had the smash hits Invisible Touch, Tonight, 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 Land of Confusion, In Too Deep, Anything She Does. There were like 8 singles off this album, and about 4 of them went to #1. And the Genesis machinery just kept on rolling. I actually saw them on this tour at Joe Louis Arena, and it was pandemonium. The minute they hit the stage, I mean, it was like a full-on rush. Everybody was trying to push towards the stage. I think they had to cancel the show at one point because it was just getting out of hand. Fans were leaping onto the stage, trying to rip off Phil Collins' shirt. It was just getting ridiculous. People were trying to go up and hug Tony Banks. It was out of hand, and it was just not an enjoyable concert to watch. It was just too much, and obviously something had to give. And so the band did take a sabbatical before they released what would be their final album with Phil Collins' We Can't Dance. But you know, it was a magical time, and it was a band that could exist and be that popular in no other era. It couldn't have happened in the 70s. It could not have, absolutely not have happened in the 90s or the 2000s back then. But it was just a magical moment. And unless you lived it, you can't fully appreciate just how huge Genesis was. So without question, they were the biggest band of the 1980s, whether you remember it or not. But I invite you, if you were around at that time, you know, search the corners of your memory, because I'm pretty sure you will agree that Genesis was unstoppable, the biggest band of the 1980s.